Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being on our program. I'm Armando F. Sanchez, and I have the pleasure of bringing back a friend, a guest who was with us 7 years ago. 7 years ago. Yeah, I know, I know. And he was so gracious with his time to present about his books, which we will highlight today. Raul Ramos y Sanchez. We're not related, I think, pero Sanchez, we are related.
Somewhere, possibly.
Somewhere. Somos Latinos. Somos Latinos. He is the author of the Class H trilogy, America Libre. Here it is. I have my collection. House Divided. I have that. And I also have Pancho Land. And I love the picture. Love the picture of holding a matralladora, a submachine gun. I love that. And he grew up in Miami's cultural kaleidoscope before becoming a long-term resident in the U.S. Midwest. After a successful career in advertising that included founding an ad agency with offices in Ohio and California, Ramos returned to his more personal, significant work. This began with development of the documentary of the public television Dos Americas, the legacy of our hemisphere, and also creating some websites. You maintain an online presence, and you're talking about U.S. immigrant community. Ni se diga, your books have received multiple awards and mentions. So I congratulate you on your work, Raul.
Thank you.
So
Thank you.
we're going to take it up from where we left off 7 years ago. And as you can see, our background is, I'm in Cuba. I don't know where you are. You might be in Ohio. Pero I'd like to pick it up where we left off 7 years ago, because I was so impacted by your topic of the time, which seemed to be like, well, you're asking very unique questions. You were looking at it from the Cuban situation. And now, 7 years later, things have changed, and I'm going to pass that on to you to talk about that. So let me first of all, today's show will be about your views of the United States, of Cuba, now that you're traveling back and forth. Love to hear about that. Tell us about what's going on about you and now beginning to travel to go to Cuba.
Well, it was a big change in my life personally, because I left Cuba at the age of 11 with my mom as a single parent. We came to the States, and we cut off all contact with our family because we were leaving behind. It was the height of the Cold War. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Bay of Pigs invasion. It was a very stressful and very difficult time. So we left thinking we would never see our family again. My mother later remarried. We moved to the Midwest, which further cut me off from the Cuban American community. And so we existed in a little bubble, my mom and I, and then she had 2 more children, which I'm very grateful for, because now I have siblings here. And we lost all contact. So 50 years passed, and through a long, complicated series of circumstances, we established contact with my family in Cuba almost 50 years to the date after we left. It was November of 1961, November of 2011, we made contact again. And so it was surreal. My mother couldn't believe it. She talked to her brother for the first time on the telephone. She said it was like a dream. Con un sueño, mijo. She couldn't believe that she was actually talking to her brother. So it took us about 2 years, and then I was finally able to go back and visit Cuba, Havana specifically, for the first time. And there you are in front of the Catedral behind you. That was one of the first places we went to see. And so since then, it's been remarkable, because from 2013 to the present, and we were last in Havana in January, in those years, we've seen an amazing number of changes there. And so over time, I can tell you a little bit more about it. I don't want to, go into that, but that's been a big, big change in my life. And then also in between there, I wrote another book.
Wow. What is it? What is it?
Well, okay, so the first 3 books, as you pointed out, the Class H trilogy, are really about the Latino experience in the U.S. and in context of historical threads which have occurred in other countries, where we have, the United States has a very unique situation where we have large parts of the U.S. which were once part of Mexico and Spain. And these are territories which were historically other nations, and yet we have large populations that are Latino living in those areas, and it sets up a situation much like what we've seen in other parts of the world, which have led to ethnic tensions. And so I projected what could happen in a worst case scenario if things really went south politically, if we had a very divisive government, if we had a very, active community, and all of these things would create a nightmare scenario where we would have an ethnic conflict. And so the Class H trilogy explores that cautionary tale. How could we get to this state, which, we don't want to have happen, but we have seen happen in other places. So that trilogy was very much in the entire Latino community from my perspective. This fourth book was actually the kind of book that most people write as a first novel, which is a semi-autobiographical coming-of-age story. And it's written in Miami in the 1960s, in the assimilation of the Cuban community into the South Florida area. And I was there for that. The story is actually not about me. It's more about a neighbor's family who came over. They were very wealthy in Cuba, and they had to figure out how they were going to adapt to being broke in the United States. And having lived it as an observer, not personally, there was a lot of tragedy, there was a lot of comedy, there was a lot of angst and a lot of laughter. And so I thought that was worth commemorating. And so that's when I came up with The Skinny Years, which is
beautiful.
My fourth novel.
I see the collage of different points of that time.
Yes, yeah, they do have the Cold War, of course, which was loomed very large in everyone's life at that time.
Yes.
Hippies, surfers, soul brothers, the civil rights movement, all of that. And then, of course, South Florida was a very diverse, still is, obviously a very diverse place with a lot of different communities and stuff. One of the jokes growing up was there's several causeways between Miami and Miami Beach. And they used to say, well, Julia Tuttle Causeway was the one closest to my neighborhood. And they say, what's the longest bridge in the world? It says Julia Tuttle because it connects Havana to Tel Aviv. And so the Jewish community over at Miami Beach and the Cubans and the Puerto Ricans over here in Miami proper. So that was kind of like, and then of course we had Liberty City and Overtown, which were two traditionally Black communities. I went to high school in a predominantly Black high school. That's in the story too, of what that's like. And this whole mixture of Latinos and Anglos and different religions and, the rich people and the poor people and how that all worked out. And so that was kind of part of that story too. And I happened to do a little mini book tour in South Florida just before one of my trips to Cuba. So we got the chance to reconnect with family, reconnect with friends I hadn't seen in 30, 40 years. It was just an incredible experience around that book as well.
Tell us about what happened. Tell us what happened when I'm assuming you flew over there on your very first trip. Tell me what happened when you got off the plane.
Well, let me back up just a little bit because I think that's a very an amazing thing in and of itself. I think you're at the time we had very, 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 very skimpy relations between the U.S. and Cuba. The flights were all charters. They didn't have regular air service. It was extremely expensive. It cost $500 per person to fly from Miami to Havana.
Yeah,
and the flights were booked, and people were bringing in goods. They would take along almost like skids of things where the Cubans in Miami were bringing to their families in Cuba. And it was like a little kid waiting for Christmas morning for me, that first flight. And when I saw the island, I could see it in the distance. I remembered as a kid, I used to fly back and forth at times, and when you could still travel back and forth, and seeing that little coastline coming up in the distance, and how I would start to get excited. And now here I was 52 years later seeing it again. And it was the only time the plane ever, I've made several flights back since then, but it's the only time that we actually came in right over right over the city, the bay. And I'm looking down, and it was, again, it was such an experience to go back and think that it was something I never, ever thought I'd see again. And to see that was just incredible. And you get off the plane, and there's a crowd of people waiting to see their relatives, and you're just looking at all those faces, and they're all looking at you, and you're trying to pick out, a familiar face, and you feel like you're a rock star or on the red carpet, because everybody's looking at you, and waving and smiling. And so it was just from the very beginning, it was just insane. And we just cried and laughed, and it was just fantastic. I had one uncle still alive, three aunts still alive, and probably 24 cousins. And remarkably, all the ones that were old enough to remembered me, and they remember my mom. And you know how Latino families are. They could be separated for decades, thousands of miles, and you're hugging and kissing.
You pick it up right where you left off the following day. Absolutely.
And then, thanks to one of my cousins, this is all the relatives on my mom's side.
Wow.
One of my cousins on my mom's side says, because we'd lost touch with my father or any of his family. He went door to door, located the last address of where my father had been known. He went around. Now imagine, you probably wouldn't do this in the U.S. and go around knocking on neighbors' doors, do you know so-and-so? Well, we found out that my dad had passed away very young, but that I had a brother.
Oh, wow.
And so I found out I had yet another brother, and his mom is just the most wonderful person in the world. I call her Mima now. She's become like a second mom to me. And that whole side of the family, I've reconnected with as well.
Wow.
And so it has been just like it was like Christmas morning, and all these gifts were there for me, all of these people that I've reconnected with. And now, I just this morning, I was using WhatsApp to contact my stepmom, and we had a deer in the backyard. Just happened to be walking. So I texted her, and I sent her the picture. I said, "Look, Mima, look what was walking through my backyard." She said, "If that guy was walking through the neighborhood in Cuba, somebody would eat him."
I was gonna say, eat dinner, boy.
So it's fantastic, because now those people are in my life every day, practically, through social media, through WhatsApp, and all those things. I'm able to stay in touch with that side of the family. So it's been an incredible experience, just incredible.
If I remember correctly, there was a period of time where people could not go from United States to Cuba, but people were going through Mexico or through Canada because they had relationships, with them. So would it have been possible to have gone to Cuba prior to that through the back doors that were at that time?
Yeah, it's a really complicated thing.
Right.
The U.S. has officially only family members. Anybody who's a family member or it shares a household with. So like, even if I had a roommate, if my wife and I just lived together, she could still go with me to Cuba. So family visits have always been pretty much good. Bush expanded it to more than immediate family. Obama really opened it up.
Right.
And the other factors were, like, you could go for cultural exchange, you could go for technical conferences. What you could not do was tourism. Tourism was not allowed. And Obama chose to just sort of, those laws didn't go away, but they just sort of chose to not enforce them. And so beginning in 2013, when we first went, it was still pretty strict. And the economy showed it. The downtown La Habana Vieja, Old Havana, which is the historic part of the city, your background, is part of it. It was like a movie set. The buildings were there; they were being restored on a, I believe it was World Heritage Site funds that were coming in.
Oh, yes.
But it was just the outside of the buildings. You could look inside, and they were just empty. They were shells. That was the first trip, and then everyone knows about the American cars. They've got the old cars. They were all hand painted. They had them held together with baling wire. They were rusty and stuff. And then both Obama and the Cuban government did a very, very positive thing. The Cuban government privatized all of the hospitality industry, which meant that people could open up B&Bs in their homes. They could open up restaurants in their homes. You could use your car to ferry people as a taxi. And within a few years, it was remarkable to change. By 2016, you were seeing the cars were being painted up with really nice cut because they were charging tourists $50 an hour to ride around in them. There were almost everywhere you go, you'd walk down the street, there'd be a little placard, there's like a little anchor symbol on the houses. It meant there was a room available to rent. People started investing in apartments and fixing them up and making them rental properties. People were restoring their cars to, they were using them as taxis and charging money. And it, to the point where by late 2017, I actually saw a billboard for a dog grooming parlor for Cuban and puppies. You could buy purebred puppies. I thought, you know, when you've got dog grooming parlors and you're selling purebred puppies, because you can find a lot of dogs on the street. You don't have to pay for them. Things are looking good. And then, you know, we had a change in Washington. We had all of a sudden, you know, we wanted to punish the entrepreneurship in Cuba. We wanted to do that. And since then, things have definitely declined. The cruise ships have stopped. A lot more people they've stopped investing. There were hotels under construction, and they're still being constructed, but not with the hope of the occupancy that they had before. And then, of course, the sonic attack thing, the Havana syndrome, has really hurt tourism as well, because the groups, and this is my opinion, but they've stopped. American groups have stopped going down because I think it's liability issue. They don't want to get sued for people having, you know, some kind of symptoms and then saying you brought me down here and we were victims of a sonic attack. So things have gotten difficult in the last couple, 3-4 years as we've sort of given in to the dinosaurios. And that's another interesting thing about South Florida has changed, because when I came over, everyone who came was very conservative. They were very anti-Castro. But what I've found is that since then, there have been other generations of Cuba that have come over, and they're much more sanguine. They're not, they understand that that's not the workers' paradise, but they also understand that they have family down there. And every time that you do something to try to hurt the Cuban government, you're really hurting your own family. And so they're not for all of these kinds of, you know, restrictive policies. So I think that's changing as well.
I'm only thinking about, how do people in Cuba see the world if they see it differently? The other thing is a sort of a sidebar question, but it's one that I run into. I've been very fortunate to travel many parts of the world. Usually when there is a vacuum that the US created in pulling back in its policies, usually I find that China fills in that vacuum. So I don't know if that happened. So let me pass it back to you.
There is definitely a Chinese presence. The buses, almost all the buses in Havana now are Chinese. You could see that very, very clearly. I don't know. I know that there's I talked, because we've stayed with family. We've also stayed at Airbnbs. So part of our trip we spend with family, but not. So I talked to the Airbnb people, and they said, oh, they get a lot of Chinese, a lot of Americans, a lot of Germans, and other Latin Americans who come as well to Cuba. But I think it's definitely been a case, exactly what you said, that China is stepping into the vacuum.
Yeah, yes. China comes in not only with its heavy tourism, of course, but they also bring purchasing a lot of properties. And at the beginning, everybody's happy, and at the end, everybody's unhappy because they raise the prices so high. So that's a challenge that I see, you know, ongoing as well. Yeah. And but from what I'm hearing from you is that there's a different generation, so there's a different attitude and outlook at that. But what kept running through my mind as I was hearing your story is you went from Cuba to one extreme, i.e. Ohio, like you said, the number of people you could associate just kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Now all of a sudden you're opening a new chapter, and it's just exactly the opposite. Now you're going back and opening all your old history. How does that make you feel?
You know, it makes me realize that I've spent the majority of my life in terms of years in the United States. And it's the language, English is, I speak English much better than I speak Spanish. I've been educated in the American educational system. Culturally, I'm very much an American. You know, the things that I understand best are things that are American. But Carlos Aire, he's an author who wrote a very good book about the immigrant experience called Waiting for Snow in Havana. He was talking about culture and the language. And he said, I'm going to say it in Spanish first, and then I'll translate it for the English. Español es un enano, pero es el enano que tiene las llaves de mi alma. Mm-hmm. And he said, Spanish for me is a dwarf, but it's a dwarf who holds the key to my soul. And that's the part of me that, even though chronologically it's a small part of my life, from the standpoint of, you know, who I am, mm-hmm. is a huge part of my life. Mm-hmm. And so I feel very fortunate that I'm able to have this ability to immerse myself in Cuban culture and be accepted, and immerse myself in American culture and be accepted. I have a lot of advantages. You know, I speak the language well. Most people wouldn't even identify me as a Latino if in terms of so many things. But it gives me a perspective that I think is very fortunate. And for better or for worse, I'm able to see things that a lot of people aren't.
Absolutely. Actually, I'm going to call you on that one. One of them that I run myself into a lot. As you know, I'm a speaker on cruise ships, so I get to go again around the world and many times. And one of the words that keeps coming up, and people come up to me and says, "Are you an American?" I said, "Yeah, I grew up in Mexico, and I've been to South America." They say, "No, no, no. Are you an American?" I said, "Let me tell you this again. There's North America and South America. They're both Americas, and there's a Central America. When you say America, especially in my topic of espionage, I said, you don't want to tell a Russian attack America and they're going to bomb Brazil, because that's America too." So I said, are we talking about the United States, or are we talking about America? Because American, there's a whole mess of us, you know. And the other thing that I always crack up on, and people says, you know, what do you think is better than English and Spanish? I said, why am I still fighting the war of Europe? They're both European languages. I don't care what they did back then. I just happen to be born in one and I learned the other, you know. But I'm still fighting between Spain and England. You know, you're not gonna get me caught in this topic between English and Spanish. But culturally, you know, we're embroidered. Both languages are embroidered. And I said, you know, I live in Los Angeles. He says, "Oh, Los Angeles." I said, exactly the point.
That's right.
We have the two languages, depends how you pronounce it. So you brought up those interesting issues, like you're saying, that kaleidoscope that we say, no, 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 you're an American. I said, well, North America, yeah. You know.
Yeah.
So take your pick on that. So thank you for reminding
Los
me.
Los Tigres del Norte somos más americanos.
There you go. You know, so, but you have to be, you know, I hear the word americano. Somos americanos. Eres americano. I said, well, what part? You know?
Yeah.
Because there's many of us, but absolutely, to speak Spanish or not to speak Spanish, imagine how many millions of people we can't talk to.
Yeah.
You know?
It's you know, to live on the hyphen, as I've heard someone say.
I like that.
Right? Living on the hyphen.
I hadn't thought of that one.
Cuban American, Latin American, you know, so we have an identity which I think is unique. And it in some ways, I mean, you know, if you go back through U.S. history, we're seeing the same movie shown again with different actors, right? That, you know, every immigrant group that's come, and starting with the Germans, you know, Ben Franklin wrote a screed complaining about the Germans who refused to learn our language, refused to accept our customs, you know, and from the English. And then it went on to the next group that came in, and it was, you know, Irish, and it was Italians, and it was Eastern Europeans, and, you know, every immigrant group has had their time in the barrel. But the difference with Latin Americans, with Latinos, is that none of those other immigrant groups could ever say our ancestors lived here before. And that is a difference. And that's really one of the premises of the whole Class H trilogy, is that as Latinos, we do have a unique immigrant experience and a unique immigrant heritage. And there have been places where, like, if you go back and look at 1948, the United States recognized the right of Israel to lay ancestral claim to territory in which no Jews had lived in for over, I don't know how many thousands of years.
Yeah.
And they said, but you lived there once before, so you have a right to have it back. What do the revolutionaries in the Class H trilogy say? America, United States, you set the example for us, so we're following your lead. So again, there are historical precedents for things like that, and so we set ourselves up for that possibility.
Raul, I want to continue this train of thought, but I'm going to shift it a little, because you're very special to me, especially in the awareness of the cultural ethnic conflict. There was a question I found in preparation for our interview in 2013. I'd like to bring back that question to you and have you answer it now, given the time, the modern politics that we're finding ourselves in. The question was back then, and now I ask the question today. The turmoil of the Class H series, your books, parallels similar ethnic conflict with the Basques in Spain, the Tamils of Sri Lanka, the Chechens in Russia, and the Balkans. Do you believe a similar conflict could ever develop in the United States? This is 2020.
Well, I think that question is why I wrote the book. And it's written as a cautionary tale. It points out the examples that history has shown us. And you don't have to go back very far in history to see them. Mm-hmm. And it asks the question, you know, is this the future that we want for the United States? And if not, how can we avoid that? And I think that one of the things that I learned from my experience of having grown up in a politically divided country, in a country that was torn by revolution, is that it is remarkable how fast things can change when people lose faith in their government. And I mentioned that in the skinny years. In fact, one of the things is that the Cuban Batista had a military of over, I think it was 50-something thousand soldiers. They had a very heavy-handed Policía Nacional, which was kind of like a special police, and instilled fear in everyone. But the day that Batista left the country in fear, he flew out on New Year's Eve of 1959. There were not enough soldiers. There were not enough police. There were not enough, because the people said, it's over. He's gone. It's done. And it's a flip of a switch, because the government really only exists in our minds, in our collective will. And when that snaps, it can happen so fast that changes can be cataclysmic and very, very quick. And so it's important that each of us, you know, realize that we hold here more than any place else the idea of a government, and that we have to believe that it's just, that we have to believe that it serves us. We have to believe that it is worthy of support. And when a large percentage of the population suddenly loses that belief, then you have all those examples that you mentioned, the Chechens, the Basques, the Sri Lankans, even the ones that have not succeeded, but have created great chaos in a country. And so I wanted to point out the historical possibility that something like that could happen to the United States. So I think that if anything, we've grown closer to the possibility that the books presented than we've drawn away from.
I think we took many things that you mentioned for granted, and we thought there's no way they're ever going to be challenged, that life was going to stay normal, that people were going to be respectful, that the government was going to be trustworthy all along. And I think we're all growing up a little bit and saying, maybe it's not true. Maybe this new myth of replacing the old one is not for the betterment of everyone. There's a few concentrated people that says, oh yeah, let's go back to their envisionment of some kind of Nazism, that would be better. But this is, I think, so far the minority. But what is occurring and the way it's evolved keeps reminding me of your books. I keep remembering you. I keep remembering what you said, even back there, like I said, 7 years ago. So that's why I was just super, super thrilled to make sure you were on the show. So how did you figure it out? Who gave you that prophetic side to you?
Again, personally, having lived through a revolution, having seen how it tears people apart, and Armando, the other thing that I really found fascinating was that I was going back and forth between Miami and Havana at the height of the Cold War. And I would go to a rally in Cuba and I would hear them yell, Cuba sí, Yankees no, Cuba sí. And they talk about the capitalist octopus and all of that kind of stuff. And then I would come back to Miami and I'd see my neighbors and I go, these people aren't, where's the octopus? I don't see the evil. I don't see, but yet I would hear them, talk about the crazy communist and, and I realized that it's everybody thinks they're right. Everybody thinks they're doing what's best. Nobody thinks they're the bad guy. And so the real enemy is extremism of thought, extremism of deed, that if you're not willing to listen to someone else and to hear and see their point of view, then that's the problem. Not that there are different points of view, but rather the inability to recognize their humanity, to recognize that they have needs and wants, and you do the same. And I think that is what I would want to see as the takeaway from it, is that extreme politics feed on themselves. Extremists love extremists because they help pull the middle away from each other into extreme positions. And so what we need to do is look for ways in which our common humanity and celebrate those, and then look at the dangers of what happens when we don't. And I think that's the takeaway that I wanted to have my books to scare, because let's face it, you have to have blood on the street before the media even pays attention. There have been over the last 3 years, there have been, I don't know, thousands and thousands of people that have demonstrated for various reasons. But it wasn't until there was rioting and looting and, violence that it really captured national attention. And of course, it galvanizes people. But we tend to sensationalize and overlook what we really have in common. And so that's what I was trying to do with the book, was sensationalize something so that it would scare us enough to say, wow, that's not what we want to happen.
We're getting close to ending the show. Unfortunately, we're running out of time. But you reminded me of something right now. At the end of the movie of The Hunt for Red October,
mm-hmm.
which didn't happen that way at all. But anyway, there's a sentence in there. He says, what do you think will happen now that we stole the ship? And they says, well, a revolution is a good thing every once in a while. And that sentence stuck to me. It's unfortunate, like you said, sometimes blood has to be spilled before people sort of become conscious that something is going on. And hopefully we can stop doing that. But with social media being so overwhelming, we're not even sure what's real anymore. But that's a whole different issue. I'm not going there.
Sure.
Before we come to your closing statements, could you please give us a contact information for our viewers and our
Sure.
listeners to be able to follow you and have the pleasure, like I have, to learn so much from you.
Thank you, Armando. I have a website, raulramos.com, RAULRAMOS.com. And it has my books there. You can access my blog. My Facebook page is all available through that one site. And I welcome friends on Facebook. I enjoy dialogue with people, and I do respond. I'm on there fairly frequently. So if you have anything you want to mention, I'm always there.
Thank you very much. I have 20 questions, and I'm trying to shut them all down because I need to respect the time of the show. But I'm going to have to ask one. I can't do it. I can't do it. What would you prescribe as what has to be put in place so that we can stop this spiral we're in today?
Wow, that's pretty tough. I would have to say that looking at where we're alike more so than where we're different. And I think the arts do that the best. I think Picasso said, art is the lie that tells the truth. Fiction is fiction, but yet it presents us with a view of humanity outside ourselves. We're able to experience the world through someone else's eyes, through someone else's perspective. And that kind of understanding goes a long way towards realizing that we all think we're the good guys. And yet we have to recognize that good guys and good guys shouldn't be fighting with each other.
Oh, well, you answered my question. Now I'll give you time for you to do your closing statements because, you have so much to share. We are all very blessed by hearing you.
Oh, thank you, Armando. Again, like you, I feel very fortunate that I've been able to live in these two worlds, that cultures that are alike in many, many ways, and yet they each have their own flavor. And that I've had the good fortune to be able to enjoy, to savor the salsa latina, and also the depth of European culture as well. And I feel very, very fortunate. And that is the fountain from which I try to use to infuse my work.
When you say you work, are we looking at another book in the near future?
I am working on another one, yes. But I'm not ready to say anything about it yet.
No. I'm waiting for it. You have, let me put in my order right now for it, whatever it is. You have already someone who's asking for it. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the honor of talking to Raul Ramos y Sanchez, who brings us his version, not only from his perspective of his wonderful books, and I have them all, read them all, but also his personal perspective from the experience of being a Cuban exile and then having the opportunity to reconnect himself and learning from him. So even if you or I'm talking to our audience, have not gone through the similar experience, it doesn't mean we can't learn through his eyes and through his feelings and his emotion as well. Raul, I look forward to having you in future shows. I don't want the next show to be 7 years from now, but I look forward to having you on the show again, and we'll continue the dialogue.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you
very much.